Hello guys and welcome back. So today we are diving into a crucial aspect of creating performant and efficient Android apps using pagination. So just imagine apps like YouTube or Instagram without pagination. The cost of maintaining such large datasets will be astronomical. So in this video we are going to explore the ins and outs of pagination on an Android app using Paging3 library. But we won't stop there. We are also building a simple yet powerful code app. Along the way, we'll harness the power of other essential libraries like Retrofit for seamlessly networking, employ the robust MVVM architecture for a clean app structure, and implement manual injection for an architecture that not just is efficient but also maintainable. So without any further ado, let's get started. So before we get started, you can get the initial project from the link provided in the description box below. So when you clone the project, you're going to get this folder structure here. So one thing which I have added prior to this is this utils file. And you can find here we have several endpoints and base URL to where we're going to be fetching the codes. And another thing which I have changed here is the build.gradle file and added here several dependencies. So for example, here I have added the Paging3 library for pagination and also Retrofit and other libraries for networking. Also, I have changed here is the Kotlin serialization library. So when you go to build.gradle project file, you can see that I have added this Kotlin serialization library, which you can easily get started with it. Okay, so now let's start to write our code. So this is just the API which we're going to use. So you can find the link in the description box below. So here we have several endpoints which you can use. So for our case, we're going to use this endpoint here. So we can press Ctrl C and go to the next tab here and paste this link here. So you can see here we have this output. So if you're getting raw data here, that's just normal if you don't have some extension functions in your browser. Okay, so for this case, I'm just going to click copy here in order to copy all of this data. Then going back to Android Studio so that we can get started. Okay, so now here we have to create our data package so that we can organize our codes more better. Okay, so for this case, let's create a new package and let's call this data. And inside here, we're going to fetch our data remotely. So let's create another package and call this remote. Okay, so inside here, let's create another package that is just for models. And inside here now we can create this using this Kotlin extension function. So you can get this from the extension marketplace of Android Studio. This is going to help you tremendously when you are using JSON objects. So for this case, we are going to copy what we are going to paste what we have copied from our browser. So this JSON response here, which we received. Okay, so we can name this API codes in order to get this data. And because we are going to use serialization library, when you click here advanced, then you can just change here and customize it. So for example, here we are using init with default values. And you can see here in the place of annotation, I have selected Kotlin X serialization because we are going to use Kotlin serialization library for serializing JSON object to Kotlin object. So for this case, let's click generate and it has generated 3 files. Okay, so we have here our 3 files and let's open up. And you can see now we have our API codes, we have our data, and also we have the pagination. So these are the data that are going to be returned when we make query to this API. Okay, so we have here our models, but you can see our models contain data that sometimes we cannot use them. So we want to create our own model that we can easily transfer it. Also, we can easily save it to our database and use it for later uses. So for this case, I'm going to create another package that is going to be called models. And this is the different one from that of the remote. So for this case, let's insert here a new Kotlin class. And this one, we're just going to call it codes. And this is going to be a data class. Okay, so inside here, I want to create an ID that is going to be of type of string. Another thing which we want to get here is the quote alpha, which is also going to be of type of string. Another thing is to get the quote genre, And lastly, we can get here the current page, which is going to be of type int. Okay, so now here we have our code. So the next case here is we want to transfer this object here whenever we have it. So we can create a mapper, something like mapping from these API codes to this code here. And we can easily do this. Let's go to data. As you can see, inside the data here is what we have the information. So we can easily create here an extension function that is going to help us to do this case. So let's create here a function and call this data. Changing back to our code object. Okay, so here one parameter which we are going to receive is the current page. Because when you examine here our data, we don't have the current page. So for this case, we can click here return and create our codes. Now this is easy. So here we can just pass in our ID and current page. Okay, so here we have to call this to return our codes, and everything is looking perfectly. So we can just keep this on a separate line, and we can add the names argument to call arguments to make it more readable. Okay, so here we have our extension function that we can easily convert it. Okay, so now here we have our data. The next case is let's create here our service. So let's create a new package and call this, for example, service. Let's just call it API. And inside here now let's create a new Kotlin class or file, and we can call this code service. And this is just going to be an interface. So basically here what we are going to use is Retrofit to communicate to our API. And this is just really easy. We can create here a suspend function because we are making a network request. And for this case, we can call this .getCodes. Now we can specify several parameters here to the endpoint, so you can check it. I have provided the link in the description box to the URL. So for this case, let's annotate this with @query first. And the first parameter which we want to get here is the page, because we want to limit this. So can just call this page, and this is going to be of type int. And another thing here is the limit, so the page size for this case. So the API call it a limit, so we can also call it a limit, and this is just going to be of type int. Now lastly here, our parameter is going to be the genre. So you can specify different types of genre. And this is just going to be of type of string. Now for our case, you can just give it a default value of motivational. So there are several types of these. So you can just look them from the API, and then you can just provide it here. Okay, so we have everything here looking perfectly for our service. The next case here is we have to specify the endpoint. Now because we are making a get function, so we have to call this get. And here now we have to specify the endpoint. So we can use k.api endpoints, which we have already provided from our constant file. Okay, so we have the communication to the endpoint already established. So for this case, we can create our pagination. So inside here, our data, we can create another package, and let's call this pagination. Okay, so when we want to implement pagination, we want to properly handle requests for the data from the UI and ensure that multiple requests are not sent simultaneously at the same time. So for this case, we want whenever a user reaches to the bottom point where our data is exhausted, then we can send a request and not also send, for example, 100 same requests to request the same data. So for this case, we have to define something that is called a PagingSource that is going to help us to deal with this type of logic. So a PagingSource defines the source of the data by specifying how to retrieve data in the incremental chunks. And these incremental chunks are called paging data. So we are going to see this. So the first case, let's implement our paging source. So that's really easy. So we can create here a new Kotlin class or file, and let's call this codes. PagingSource. And this is going to inherit from our PagingSource. So you can see we have to pass in here the key value pair. So the key value pair here is going to be the key that is like our page. So our key is going to be like a page, and our value is the data class that is going to be returned. So for this case, we have here our key to be an int, and our data class is going to be our codes class, which we have defined there. Okay, so also here we want to get one parameter inside our constructor. So let's create a private variable. And this is just the API service. So we can just call here our code service. Now let's press Ctrl I here to implement these variables here. So we have here the get refresh and also the load. So here is to get the refresh. So for example, whenever a user wants to refresh the data, then we want to get a key that we can easily send it back to our server in order to return us with a response. So we don't want to outdate our data. Since we have already reached, for example, to an index of 2, then we want to get the third page. So for this case here, we can use our state. As you can see, we have a state parameter that we can easily use it to get here. So let's call here our return. And we can call here state.anchor position. Okay, so when you hover around here, you can see most recently accessed index in the list. So for this case, if we have reached, for example, to the bottom, then we have the second index inside here, for example, our current page. Then we can use this key to send it to our data, to our API in order to retrieve the data. So for this case, we can use state.anchor position, as simple as that. Okay, so here we are going to implement the load functionality in order to get our data. Okay, so here we have to define the start key whenever we want to load. So we can create here a constant function inside our companion object. So let's create here a private constant variable and call this starting key. And our starting key is going to be 1 because we're going to start from the first page. Okay, so for this case, we can create here our starting key. Now here we can use our parameter to load our key if it's available inside our parameter. If it's not available, then we can just return our constant. So for this case, we can use our param.key. And if this is going to be nullable, then we can just return our starting key to make everything easy. Okay, so since here we are just going to access our network, so we can use a try-catch block to maintain this. So let's call here our return and create our try-catch block. Okay, so here we can make our request. So the first case here is using paging 3 library. You have an internal mechanism of handling error, and this is just really good. So for this case, let's handle first the error part. So the first case here, for example, if we have IO exceptions, now we can just easily call here return, and we can call load result and call .error. And pass in here the exception. That is just an IO exception. Another case here, if we have an HTTP exception, so we can just call here HTTP exception. Okay, so we can use similarly load result.error and return now our HTTP exception. Okay, so we have everything handled. So the next case here is to handle our API call. So the first case here, we can get our codes. Now let's call here our API, and we want to call get codes in order to get the codes. Okay, so we have to specify the start key, and also the page size here we can specify as params.load size in order to fetch our data. Okay, so we have to identify the next key in order to make the second request whenever we exhaust our data. So for this case, we can create here our next key. Okay, so we have one problem here. We did not return. So for a case here, we have to return our API codes. Let's go back here. Now let's just call here our codes.data. And we can check here if this is going to be empty. So it can be differently here. For example, the API can specify, for example, that our last page is going to be this. Then you can try to use that logic. So for a case here, we are checking if the data is going to be empty. Then our next key is going to be null. So this does not make sense that we send another request by incrementing if we have exhausted the data from our server. So for this case, we're going to return null. And else, if this is not the case, then we can use our codes.pagination.next page for this case. And that's just easy because this API actually implements paginations by default. Okay, so we have here our next key. Now we can use our load result. And we want to create now a page. Okay, so we have to specify the data. Now we can use our quotes. Now our data here is going to be a code, so we can use here a map function in order to map this. Okay, so for this case, we can just call it to quotes. So we have already created an extension function for this. Okay, so we have to pass in here one parameter, that is the current page. And we can easily obtain this from our codes object and call codes.pagination.current page in order to get the current page. Okay, so the next parameter here is the previous key. Now here we can use an if statement directly. Now we can check here if our start key is going to be equal to starting key, that is our variable. So we know that we are on the first page, so we cannot go to negative. So for this case, we can just return null here to tell, hey, we don't have any other page to load back. And else we can just return here start key and decrement it by 1. And for this case, we have our starting page. Okay, so our next key, we can just define here by specifying our next key. And I think everything is looking perfectly here. So we have our paging source, and now we can just retrieve our data from the server. So the next case is to connect between our paging source and our UI layer. And this we can use, the paging source is going to return us with paging data. So what is the paging data? So a paging data is like a container for paginated data. So each refresh of data will have a separate corresponding paging data that we can use to observe it inside our UI. In order to communicate between the UI and our data object, we can create here a repository to help us with this. So let's create here a new package and call this repository. Okay, now let's create here a new Kotlin class or file. And for this case, we can create an interface to make it more cleaner. So we can call this codes repository. Okay, so we are going to have only a single function here that is going to be called get codes. So if you want to expand it, you can just keep adding other functions here. Okay, so we are going to return a flow because we want to observe this. And this basically is going to return a paging data. So we can use here paging data and basically create here our codes. So when you hover around here and press Ctrl Q, you can see that this is going to be a container for page data from a single generation of load. So this is just one time, then we can send it again. So we have here our paging data and everything is looking perfectly. Now for this case, let's create a repository implementation for this. So we can create here a new Kotlin class and let's call this codes repository implementation. Okay, so this is going to inherit from our codes repository. Okay, so we want to provide here also one parameter that is just an API. And basically here now we can create our codes service as the parameter here. Let's press Ctrl I to implement this variable here. Okay, so we have to construct the paging in order to tell our UI, hey, this is just your observed way. So in paging 3, you can easily do this by creating a pager. Okay, so we have to use two parameters here in order to configure our pager. So the first case here is to provide the config. And here, for example, you can provide the paging config, and we want to specify something like the page size. So let's specify our page size. And for a case, we want our page size to start from 10. So you can have different one. And here we have enable placeholders. And for a case, I'm going just to provide here false. So you can have a different type of placeholders which you want. So you can enable this. By default is enabled. But for my case, I'm going to provide false here. Okay, so another parameter here is the PagingSource factory. So this one is going to tell, hey, this is just the source which you can use to fetch your data. And this is just the lambda function. And basically here now you can create your quotes PagingSource. And now we have to pass in here the API, but we are required to return a flow. And here we can just call flow. And everything now is looking perfectly. So we can just connect everything together with using a ViewModel. Okay, so now here we have our repository. Now let's go to our UI here, and we can create here a new package. Now let's create here a new package. Let's call this quotes, and inside here, let's create a new package also. Let's call this ViewModel. Now inside here, let's create a quoting class, and we can just call this quotes ViewModel. Okay, so this is going to inherit from our ViewModel class. And here we want one parameter inside our constructor. So let's create here a private variable, and we can just call this quotes repository. So we are going to specify a mechanism to inject the repository here, because as you can see, we are using an interface and not the implementation directly, so that when we are testing, we can easily substitute with test mockups. Okay, so in order to get this to observe it, we have to create a state, something like we can observe it from our UI. So for this case, with paging 3, we have an easy way, and using Jetpack Compose is really easy. So for this case, we can create here our quotes, and this is just going to be of type flow. And for this case, we can just call here our paging data. And basically, this is just going to be of type quotes. So for this case, we can just call here our quotes repository and call .get quotes. And what we want to do is to cache this result in our ViewModel scope. So we can call here .cached in ViewModel scope. Okay, so one thing to note here, don't combine these flows from a paging 3 library with other types of flows. So for this case, you have to keep them separately. So as you can see, this caching is going to cache the paging data such that any downstream collection from this flow will share the same paging data. So we can easily cache this data using our ViewModel scope. So whenever the ViewModel scope is going to be cancelled, then all of the data is also going to be removed from our memory, and this is going to help us to manage it efficiently. So if we have used Dagger Hilt, then probably right now here we can leave everything as it is because it's going to auto inject it. But for a case we have to do this manually, and it's just really easy. So what we can do here is let's collapse everything here and create a new quoting class or file. And for now we want to create an object, and for this case we can easily just call it a graph to help us to inject our data efficiently and so that we can manage it. Okay, so we are using here an object because this is just going to be a singleton pattern. So for this case, we want to create our repository. So our repository, we can easily create it using a let init variable. And in this case, we can just call here our API. So the first case, we have to get our quotes service by using a let init variable. Another case here is to create our repository. So now we can just call here our repository, and this is just going to be our quotes service. Our quotes repository, which is just an interface also. So to initialize this, we are going to use a by delegate method that is a lazy initialization. So here we can pass in our codes repository implementation. And here we have to pass in our API. So we are using here a byDelegate method so that we initialize this variable whenever we are going to use it. And if not, then we are going to leave everything not initialized. So for this case, we have to create one function that is called provide. So this function here is going to have a context. So if you have dependencies that requires to get a context, so you can use this context here. Now for this case, you can easily construct now your API. So for example, here we are going to use Kotlin's serialization regularly. So we have to get the content type, for example. And for a case, it's going to be application/JSON. And we have to call this to media type. Okay, so we have to initialize now our API. So we can use here our retrofit and call .builder. Okay, so we have to specify in here the base URL. So we can use here k.baseURL. And we want to add the converter factory. Okay, so since we are going to use serialization regularly here, so let's create a simple private variable here. Let's call this JSON. And now we can call here our JSON from Kotlin serialization regularly. So one thing which we want to override here is course input values. And here we can make this to be true so that we avoid some silly errors that are going to be returned by our API. So for this case, we can have ignore unknown keys. So sometimes our objects can be different from what are sent from the server. And if they are different, then it's going to crash our application. So for this case, we can just specify these two parameters here in order to make our life easier. Okay, so we can use here our JSON and call it as converter factory. And we can pass in here the content type. And I think there we have everything looking perfectly. Now let's call here .build. And we have to create here our service. Now we can create easily by using a code service here and pass in a class.java. And everything now is looking perfectly. So one thing which has remained here is to call this provide function. And in order to get this context here, and we have to initialize everything here before anything is going to take place. So for this case, we have to override an application class and do this before we create our activities. And for this case, now let's just go here directly. Okay, so here we're getting an error. Let's remove this comma here. Okay, so inside here, let's create a new Kotlin class or file. And we want to call this codes application. Okay, so this is going to directly inherit from the application class. And we have to override here the onCreate method. Okay, so before here we do anything, we can just call here our graph.provide. And basically now we can provide the context. And this is just going to be this. Then we initialize all of our variables. Now we can go back to our ViewModel. Let's go to our ViewModel. And basically now we did here directly, we did not initialize this. So we can use our graph now. And call .api. Sorry, we call our repository. And now we have everything looking perfectly. Okay, so I think everything is looking perfectly. So the next case here is to create our codes screen. So for this case, let's insert here a new Kotlin class or file inside our codes package. And for this case, let's select file and call this codes screen. Okay, now let's create here a new composable. And for this case, we can just call this codes screen. Okay, so here one parameter we're going to receive is the codes, and this is going to be a lazy paging item. And this is just from paging 3 regularly, and this is a compose function. Okay, so we have here a lazy paging items of codes items. Okay, so we are going to display our items inside a lazy column. So we can create here a lazy column. And this is just similar to recycler view. Okay, so we can create here our items. So in order to make this paging 3 work here, we have to use a count extension function for items and not pass the lazy paging items directly. And this I found it to work. So for this case, we have to call here our item count. Now we can rename this to index, because here now we have our index. Now we can use here our quotes and receive here the index. Now this can be sometimes nullable because the data could be returned as null. Now we have to use a let scope function here. Now we can use our quotes, get a single quote. So for now, let's create a quote card in order to display it. So let's go below here and create a new composable function. Let's call this quotes card. Let's make this to be private. Okay, now we are going to receive here a quote. Okay, so here is our UI which we want to achieve. So you can see we have here our card and we have these items here. So let's start to build it step by step. So the first case, we can create a column. Okay, now we can pass in here the modifier. And what we want to do is to wrap the content size and give it a padding of 12 dp. Let's import this first. Okay, so if you want also to make it clickable, you can make it clickable, or so you can navigate to another screen. So for a case, we are just going to change our background. Now we can use here our material theme and use the color scheme, and we can use the pre-body container color. Okay, now let's give it also a padding again of 12 dp. And remember that modifiers are executed sequentially. Okay, so we have here our wrapper object or the container. Now we can create here is our first like a quotation mark here. So let's create our text. Okay, so let's add another quotation mark here. So we have this in order to render this single quotation mark here. Okay, now let's pass in here our style. And basically now we can use our material theme, typography, and we want to use display large to change the display of this. Okay, now we can change our color scheme, and we can use our material theme .color scheme .on background. Okay, so we have our first text. So the second case here is to create our quote text. So for this case, let's create another text. Now here we can use our quotes, quote text in order to get the data. Another change we can make here on the style. So we can use our material theme. And now we want to use body large and change also the color. Now let's use a material color scheme and use the on background color. Now lastly here, let's pass in a modifier. And give it a start padding of 12 dp. Okay, so we have here our text ready. Now the last case here is to create this author text. So for this case, let's pass in here a little bit of a spacer. And we can give it a modifier, .height, and give it a 12 dp. Okay, now we can create here a box and pass in here a modifier. And we want to fill the max size. Okay, so the first case here, we can pass in the text. Now we want to change the modifier. And we want to align it to the center end, so we can use our alignment. Alignment.centerEnd to center it to the end. Also, we can provide here a padding of 12 dp. Now let's give it a text. And here now we can use our quotes. Quote author. Okay, also let's change here the color scheme. And we can use also the on background color. Okay, let's give it also a little bit of a spacer. So we can use here spacer.modifier and give it a height of 80 dp now. Now I think everything is looking perfectly here. So we can just go back to our lazy column. So here we can call our quotes card and pass in here our quote, and everything is looking perfectly. So the remaining thing here is to go back to our main activity now, and we have to hook up everything. Let's delete this first. And for a case, we have to get the reference to the view model, and we can easily get here our quotes view model. And here we can just call our quotes view model, and we can use a by delegate method and call view models function here. And this one is going to help us to get the reference to the view model. Okay, so we have to get to observe it as a composable state. So let's create here a variable and call this quotes paging items. So what we can do, we can use our view model, quotes view model, and call here our quotes. And what we want to do is to collect as lazy paging items. So this is just when you hover around here, you can see this collect value from this flow of paginated data and represents them inside a lazy paging item instance. So this lazy paging item instance can be used for lazy loading, as we have used it inside our lazy column. So for this case, we can just call directly here our quotes card. Sorry, we have to call here our quotes screen. So okay, so directly here we call our quotes screen, and we have to pass in here our quotes paging items. And everything is looking perfectly. Okay, so before we test run our application, what we have to do is to go to our manifest file. So one thing here, we have to add the name, because we have created here a new application class. So we have to tell our manifest file, hey, we have this file here. So let's go back to our manifest file. And here we have to call name, and this one is going to be .quotes. So this is just the name of this application here in order to make your application functioning. And because we're using an internet, so we have to specify the permission. So we have to specify the user's permission here and close it. Okay, so I think everything is looking good. Now we can try to run our application and see the output. So our app is launched successfully, and you can see we have here our data and it's well presented here. So one thing which I want to change here is this little background color here. So we can easily go to our theme. Let's go directly here to our theme. And I want to override one thing here is the primary container color inside the dark color palettes here. So for this primary container, I'm going to use this color here, which is just 0x2222325. Okay, also here inside our light color scheme, we can change it. So we can override our primary container color. And for this case, I'm going to use 0x3f7f9. So you can easily copy it and change it. Now let's try to rerun again and see. Now I think everything is looking perfectly as our design. So now let's try to scroll to the bottom. So you can see we had only first to load 20 items. Now we have like an infinity scroll up because we have implemented pagination. And this is how you easily implement Paging3 library using pagination. So this is just the scratch on the neck using Paging3 library. So if you want, for example, to cache the data in the local database, you can use remote mediators. So if you want to learn more about Paging3 library and how to implement a clean architecture in Android application, I have a comprehensive course. The link is provided in the description box below. So if you find value out of this video, please don't forget to provide a like and subscribe for more videos like this one. So until next time, bye bye.